This week we're going to go on to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 covers multilingualism and language choice. Some of the important terminology that you need from this chapter will be in this presentation. And let's start out with the term language vitality. So the term vitality, applied in a sociolinguistic context, describes well, it really is kind of self-explanatory, the vitality of a language based on the demographic, social, and institutional strength of a language and its speaker. Vitality is different from prestige. Prestige concerns the power structures that determine a preferred language or form of language. So it might be that a certain language or variety of language has vitality and that a lot of speakers speak that form, and yet it might not have prestige, which means that the governmental structures don't necessarily condone or put that variety forth. So a language can have vitality and not prestige, and vice versa. So diglossia, this term applies to two languages that are used in a single speech community, and it also can refer to two types of languages. Early on in this chapter, really throughout the chapter, it's dealing more with bilingualism and multilingualism and less with style shifting and varieties, but it could fall under this umbrella as well. No nation in the world is completely monolingual. It's an interesting thought. It's true. Though some have invisible languages, which mean if you look up the official language, there may only be one. But invisible languages are those that aren't accepted. They don't enjoy prestige. Language policy and language planning can shape perceptions about language. Implied and overt language policy are both integral to the way that we perceive languages and the way that languages are shaped. Overt language policy formalizes use and recognition of languages in institutional and national context. So it might declare a certain language as the national language, for example. Implied language policy concerns the unspoken attitudes about what form of language should be used in specific contexts, what form of language has most prestige, in other words. Our book talks about post-apartheid language policies is a really vivid illustration of how language policy can affect prestige. So I'm going to let you guys read through that on your own. It's, I think, a really good argument that's very clearly stated in our text. And it also talks about language rights in Vanuatu's constitution, and it gives you the language from each constitution. Page 118 talks about the constitution, the post-apartheid constitution in South Africa, which recognizes the official languages of the republic are, and then it has quite a long list. Let's see. The Constitution goes on to say a number of other things, recognizing the historically diminished use and status of the indigenous languages of our people. The state must take practical and positive measures to elevate the status and advance the use of these languages. So that's the government there exerting a language policy to try to give these other languages more prestige. Then Vanuatu's Constitution lists the languages, the national languages of the Republic of Vanuatu. The national language is Bislama. The official languages are Bislama, English, and French. The principal languages of education are English and French, so it's more specific there. The Republic of Vanuatu shall protect the different local languages which are part of the national heritage and may declare one of them as a national language. So it's interesting to see how policies can shape these language attitudes. Ethno-linguistic vitality is a measure of the strength and liveliness of a language, and this is usually a good indication of whether that language will die out or continue to be used as the living language of a community. These measurements include such things as demographics, social support, institutional support. All of these things can affect the vitality of a language. Our book has a chart on page 121 that talks you through factors that influence language vitality. You can see it has vitality at the top. It talks about status, economic, social status of speakers, then the demography, and then institutional support. And it talks about that both at a formal and informal level. And then it gives a couple of examples, and one example is the long-standing status of Latin. So basically, vulgar Latin, the Latin spoken in the streets of Rome, is what we have as Italian today. But the status of classical Latin as a written language has maintained a lot of prestige through the ages. In the Middle Ages, it was kind of the European language of learning that extended on into the Renaissance. The Latin language has had a lot of prestige, and this is because it has a lot of institutional support. In the Middle Ages, primarily that support came from the church. Where Latin was the language of religion. It was a language in law courts. So that just shows how a government government and institutions can shape the status of a language. Our book also talks about language vitality in Canada, and then in Wales. Page 125, that's a really interesting passage to read. The Celtic languages, which include Welsh, are greatly diminishing, and there has been a conscious effort to increase their vitality, a conscious effort made by native speakers and by the government. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week when we look at diachronic language change as it relates to sociolinguistics. So this chapter also introduces the concepts of code switching and code mixing. And these are terms that are sometimes used interchangeably if you're reading in different texts. There's a little bit of confusion about which is which. But our text presents code mixing as the alternation between varieties within sentence and clause boundaries. So within a sentence, if you're switching back and forth from one language to another, can also be one style or another. Code switching is an alternation across sentence or clause boundaries. Both can happen within the speech of a monolingual speaker because stylistically you can code switch and code mix. Whereas I might be talking to someone very informally and then throw in some stylistically formal kinds of speech or specialized speech that's distinct to a profession. And it can also be apparent in the speech of bilingual speakers alternating between languages. And that's the main topic of this chapter. There's an exercise on page 129 that talks about this kind of code switching and code mixing, and gives you a specific example. This is not one of the exercises I had you work, but you might want to consider it. And there's a chart on page 131 which I think this all happens often at a very subconscious level, but it shows how we kind of map out in our minds what code to use. If any of you are bilingual and fluent in two languages or more, it would be interesting for you to go through this chart and think about how you make these language choices. Where am I with family? We kind of did this in the past in previous chapters, thinking about different styles. If you're with family and you're issuing a directive, it'll be very different. If not, it might be otherwise. So this talks through how speakers might decide. And this decision tree is used for a pidgin by students in Hawaii. Pidgin, by the way, is a kind of a artificial language created specifically for the purpose of communication between speakers of two different languages. And over time, if it develops more fully, it becomes what we know as a Creole. I think we talk about that next week. I want to talk specifically about a form of code mixing and code switching that we have here in the United States that is probably quite familiar to all of you, and that's Spanglish. The term itself is a good example there of blending. The term really goes back to 1933 to a novel where the term was just thrown in that this kid brother was on uncly terms with small Andy. He even started at once on a sort of Spanglish with Pancha, and thus the term was coined. Spanglish is very controversial. The Royal Academy, the Language Academy in Spain, has declared it non-existent, and yet millions of Latinos speak it. And as far as prestige, and vitality, Spanglish doesn't have much prestige, but I would argue that it does have some vitality. In a guest editorial of Hispania, Dominita Dumitrescu writes that Spanglish is a derogatory term and it reinforces misperceptions about the dialect. And I've had students who are native speakers of Spanish who say that they have prohibited their children from using Spanglish, from mixing English and Spanish, and or that their parents prohibited them from mixing terms. But here's some, let's dispel some misperceptions about Spanglish. It is not the result of mental laziness or lack of knowledge. It isn't necessarily, oh, this person just doesn't know English or Spanish properly. That's not the case at all. It's sometimes much more deliberate than that. It is not the birth of a new language. Spanglish is really basically a dialect. It doesn't even, I would argue, qualify as a pidgin. It is not a dialect plagued by unnecessary anglicisms, as some speakers, Spanish native speakers might call it. By the way, I don't speak Spanish. French is my, French and Old English are my languages. It is not the dialect spoken by U.S. Hispanics, but it's one of several socio-dialects. And I would argue the same is true if you've heard of Ebonics, that there isn't one Ebonics, that it very much varies from one region to another among speakers. It's a socio-dialect distinct to different groups in society. Spanglish also is not an erosion of Spanish. That's a misperception. It's not really an impure variety of Spanish, though some native Spanish speakers view it as such. And it really doesn't necessarily denote an incomplete mastery of either language. And it is gaining some prestige. There is a dictionary of Spanglish. There are actually several. There are children's books. There are actually some guides, some informal guides, and then actually textbooks about Spanglish and how it connects to identity. Because language, one thing we're learning in this class, is how much language is a part of our identity, a part of our social identity. And there was a Dora the Explorer episode of Spanglish. Comic Bill Santiago writes that Spanglish is the Reese's Buttercup of language. Hey, you put Spanish in my English. Classic example of code switching and code mixing. Linguist Elon Stavens notes that to fully understand Spanglish, the history of English needs to be taken into consideration too. Samuel Johnson recognized that language is in constant mutation. Many others have recognized that as well. Language is always changing and evolving, and English has always been a language with a lot of borrowing. And if we go way back in time, we'll learn more about this next week. The Norman Conquest in the year 1066, that was the year that French came over the English Channel and invaded England. They were specifically Norman French. And what they did is they displaced the Germanic speakers, who were the original speakers living in England, and just displaced them in positions of power, so that from the year 1066, really through the Middle Ages, French became the language of prestige. French, along with Latin, were the language of prestige. English still maintained some vitality, but it did not have prestige. And those impositions of power obviously have a lot to do with shaping the language. So these Norman invaders came over and they displaced a lot of the English, the Anglo-Saxon nobility and people in powers of in positions of power, like the church, who would have been literate. And so for about 200 years after the year 1066, French was the language of the upper class in England. And that led to a lot of code switching and code mixing. And very different circumstances, but it's the same kind of blending of languages that we see today in the United States, with where we have a lot of speakers of Spanish, speakers of English, and language always just continues to change and evolve and adapt. One result of the Norman conquest was that we ended up with hybrid terms you never know were hybrid unless you research them. Gentleman, gentil is an old French root, and then man is an old English base. So we put together a French component and an English component, melded them together, and got a new word. Gently, gentleness. Many other examples of these hybrid terms entered into the language. Eager and poor and faith are all French roots. And the words have changed a lot. If you speak French, they've changed in both France and English over time. But the ly ending for eagerly is Old English. So we got a French base and an Old English suffix, and we put it together to create a new word. And other examples here that show you these are all hybrid terms that combine elements of two languages. And this also happens with Spanglish. An example is EAR as a suffix, which is just appended to an English term, and it creates a new infinitive. So we have reward, which is an English term, and in Spanglish, you can simply put this suffix on the end of it, and boom, you've got a new term, a term that's a hybrid. Even bullshit is one. Google computer language is interesting because it's somewhat universal in form, doesn't change a lot from language to language. With borrowing, we often have duplication of terminology, and that's happened with both Spanglish, and it happened back after the Norman conquest. Sometimes one word will gain favor and the other word will disappear. So Old English had a word for property. It was acta, but the Old French word cattel, we borrowed, and we still have that term. It's our term cattle. Now, though, it doesn't refer to any property. It just refers specifically to, your cows. The word property is Latin in origin. Burg sittendum, that meant literally city, sitting person. Was the Old English term. We borrowed Old French citizen, and the Old English term disappeared, and the French term came in. So after a little bit of code switching, code mixing among speakers, sometimes one term or the other would win out. Where both words survive, sometimes they would have different meanings. So doom was the Old English term, and we borrowed from Old French the term judgment. They now have different meanings. They didn't used to. Stench and aroma used to mean the same thing, but we had the Old English word stench, and then we borrowed from the French aroma, and we ended up keeping both terms, one with more negative connotations than the other. Other examples, it's interesting, cow, calf, pig, deer, snail, those are all English, but we borrowed from the French the names that we use for the food produced from those animals: beef, veal, pork, venison, and escargot. We also had in the Middle Ages Latin, as I said before, which had great prestige. So during the Middle Ages, we ended up with sometimes 3 synonyms. So these words, rise, mount, and ascend, the first in each of these trios is Anglo-Saxon or English in origin. The second is a French borrowing, and the third is a classical Latin borrowing. French is a Romance language that's related to Latin, but it's related to Vulgar Latin, the Latin spoken in the streets. So that's, borrowing makes languages very rich with possibilities. That's something that you can see from this. And you can argue that there are no true synonyms certainly in English, that these words differ. A fire and a flame and a conflagration, I think of those as slightly different. Might be fun for you to look and think about how you distinguish these terms. By the way, if you like what we're talking about right now, sign up for History of the English Language in the fall. It will be solely online like this course. Wonderful course. Yours truly is teaching it. Not why it's wonderful, it's just fascinating subject. So borrowing is also critical in Spanglish. Spanglish loanwords, Spanish has a word for frozen, but Spanglish creates a new word by adapting the English word, creating what's basically a synonym, frisado. In Spanish, there is already a term for department building where faculty is housed, but in Spanglish, the term has stretched to refer to faculty, the people who teach in that building. Spanglish and English have the same word, Spanish and English have essentially the same word for cereal, but Spanglish adopts its own term. Why? How does this happen? It's just the nature of language to evolve in these ways. Just as we saw some duplication of terms with the old medieval French borrowings, we have the same today with Spanglish borrowings. By the way, we have so many borrowings already from the Spanish language. Really, French and Spanish are both big influences on modern English. So there's some examples here of some Spanglish synonyms that are introduced. Other times, Spanglish borrowings may just be slight alterations of English words, such as the EAR suffix that I mentioned before, or an E prefix on an otherwise English word. And so here are some examples. Here we have the English sentence, I'll prepare myself a sandwich. Here is the Spanish version. Notice the word sandwich is the same in both languages. And then here in Spanglish, both the Spanish and the English word are adapted phonetically to create a new word. Here we have, let me go back, sorry. Vicks Vapor Rub does miracles, English. Here we have the Spanish version, and then the Spanglish version has its own word for Vicks Vapor Rub, and then it has Spanish, and then we have an English word, so that you can see the code switching right there. And then finally, I think I left it in my locker. There it is in Spanish, and here in Spanglish, it borrows the English word locker, and the word is adapted, the syntax is adapted as well. It's common that Spanglish words are created by simply giving English words new spellings and new pronunciations, like Medicare, feeling becomes feeling. Sometimes words are so modified that it's hard to recognize the English or Spanish source of the original. So these are all examples of terms that are considered Spanglish. So back to code switching, alternation between two or more languages or variety of languages in a single conversation. So let's talk about why Spanglish is formed. Why do people go back and forth between Spanish and English, specifically Spanish, native speakers of Spanish who live in the United States? One, it might be if you're just learning a new language, anyone knows that, and you can't think of a word, you go to your native tongue. But there are other reasons as well. Sometimes it's quite deliberate to show that one is bilingual and has a rich heritage of both and appreciates both. It can be a deliberate thing. It can be, as I just said, a mental device. If you're forming the new sentence in the new language, then you might need, what is that word? What is that word? And so you have the native tongue word if you're trying to speak English and just learning it. Sometimes it's to form companionship with another bilingual. It's kind of a way of sharing a heritage. If the English and Spanish versions have slightly different meanings, then you might be speaking in Spanish, and then you think of a word where there really isn't a Spanish equivalent, or vice versa, so you throw in the English word. Anyone who's done any translating knows that there are some words for which there just really isn't an equivalent in another language. Here's some more reasons. This is from an NPR Code Switch blog, which is a really good blog. One is that bilingual speakers sometimes, especially if you were born in your family speaks Spanish, but then you're in a community where everyone speaks English and you're very fluent in both, or maybe you're fluent in 3 languages and you don't even think about it. It's inadvertent. Your lizard brain takes over and you just do it. Both languages are just in your head. Our book mentions the theory called translanguage and then dispels it, but it's the kind of radical theory that maybe that really language boundaries, languages as distinctions aren't maybe a mental thing at all, that if you have these different systems in your mind, they just work together. So you don't even think about it. Maybe you do think about it. And in some instances, maybe it's to ingratiate yourself to others. I've seen other Tex-Mex restaurants sometimes deliberately use Spanglish to appeal to customers. They want don't want to alienate customers who aren't fluent in Spanish, but they do want them to have this feel of authenticity. And maybe we want to say something in secret, like if you're with your English-speaking friends, and there's one other friend who, like you, is fluent in another language, and you want to tell them something you don't want the others to know. Maybe that's rude, but that's another reason for this kind of code switching and code mixing. Well, it isn't new. It isn't distinct to us today. This is from Geoffrey Chaucer's General Prologue of the Canterbury Tales. All of the words that are in black font are English or Latin words, and all of the words that are in red font would have been considered code switching at that time, because all of those words are of French origins. They were French borrowings. So it would be like sprinkling your English speech with Spanish today. And we don't even think about that today when we read Chaucer's General Prologue. But here it is. And this is several hundred years after the Norman conquest. That influence of French has really mixed into the English language. It's wonderful how language changes. And Chaucer's Summoner brags about code mixing, that he brags about sprinkling in a few Latin words here and there to make him sound like he's more prestigious. And here's some examples of some code mixing and code switching. Here it can be throwing in a single word, bueno, bye. It can be here in a full sentence. Or here, I'm going home, pasado mañana, just a couple of words here. This one is code switching because we have two sentences. We cross boundaries, one in English and then the next one in Spanish. And then this one at the end, I put as code switching as well because it's a clause. We go from one clause to another. So those are all examples. So I want to end this discussion with, I think this is near the end of your chapter, and our text talks a little bit about cultural sensitivity and social sensitivity to borrowing and co-opting. So English has historically borrowed quite heavily from other languages. Had the Norman conquest not happened, English would sound a lot like German. English is a Germanic tongue. And if you look at like Beowulf in the original, I'll show you a few lines from Old English with our next, I think it's next week's video. You wouldn't even recognize it. So after all the French borrowings came in and language continued to evolve, language changes a lot and we borrow heavily. Co-opting foreign terms, though, is something that can be seen as insincere or even offensive. And this is particularly true if a speaker isn't fluent in a foreign language and there's an easily translatable option readily available, and yet you just say, hey, hombre, that could be seen as something that people need to be aware of. Because at the end of the day, the thing that we need to keep in mind is how much language is a part of our social identity. The way that we speak, the language that we choose shapes who we are, shapes how we perceive our society. So those are some of the main thoughts from this chapter. I'd be curious if you guys have any comments, especially any of you who might be bilingual or even trilingual. If you have thoughts about code switching and code mixing, I'd very much like to hear them. Maybe you can put them into to this week's assignments. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.